I'm reading out of the Reference Guide to Regulatory Compliance on page 525. Just finished discussing pertinent definitions of deposits and types of deposits. And in subsection 4, requirements under Reg D, maintenance and reporting of reserves. That is. Is Part A. Each bank, U.S. bank of a foreign bank, an EDGE or agreement corporation must maintain reserves against its deposits and euro currency liabilities. A report of deposits must be filed within the Federal Reserve Bank in the district where the institution is located. Information on deposits must be reported to the Federal Reserve on Form FR 2900. U.S. branches of foreign banks and EDGE or agreement corporations must assign the low reserve tranche to one office or a group, and offices filing a single aggregated report. If it cannot be fully utilized by a single assigned to other by a single office or a group filing a single report, the unused portion may be assigned to other offices or groups at the same institution until the amount is exhausted. Exemptions from reserve requirements should be assigned to only one office or group of offices filing one report. For purposes of maintaining reserves, an institution will be deemed to be located in the Federal Reserve District that contains the location specified in the institution's charter, organizing certificate, license, or articles of incorporation, or as specified by the institution's primary regulator. And fourth, reserves are measured over a common maintenance period. For example, this particular activity can be, the Form 2900 has to be filled out, but the maintenance of the reserves can be done through a Federal Home Loan Bank if it's arranged that way, and the maintenance period can be 2 weeks if you have if you qualify as a single office, single report, and are approved to do so due to the level of assets. The form of the reserves, Section B, under requirements. Reserves may be held as 1. Vault cash, 2. A balance maintained with the Federal Reserve Bank, and 3. A pass-through account maintained by a non-member bank, a U.S. branch of a foreign bank, or an EDGE or agreement corp in a bank that maintains reserves at the Federal Reserve Bank. A pass-through account can also be kept in a Federal Home Loan Bank, in the National Credit Union Administration Central Liquidity Facility, or in a bank that has been authorized by the Federal Reserve to pass through reserve balances. Only one pass-through account may be designed by the financial institution. The pass-through account may be designated by the financial institution. The pass-through correspondent will not be held responsible for the accuracy of the reports submitted by respondents. And also 4, 5, 6, and 7. 4. Cash items forwarded to a Federal Reserve Bank for collection are not counted as a reserve balance until the expiration of the Reg J check collection deadlines. 5. A bank using a pass-through account must choose only one institution to maintain the account and must submit reports of deposits directly to the Federal Reserve. There's rules for maintaining reserves, and an excess balance is an average balance carried by the institution in an account at a Federal Reserve Bank or over a reserve maintenance period that exceeds the balance required to satisfy the reserve requirement. So, back to 1 and 2. 1. Reserves may be held as vault cash, which includes A and B. A, U.S. currency and coin owned and booked as an asset by a depository institution. Satisfied depositor claims in either held at the depository institution's location or held at an alternate location if the depository institution has ownership rights to the currency and coin. has booked them as an asset, and no other institution has a claim on the currency and coin. The alternate location must be close enough to the depository institution that cash ordered by 10 a.m. can be received by 4 p.m. of the same day, and there must be a written agreement in place to facilitate the delivery. And B, U.S. currency and coin in transit to the Federal Reserve Bank is another way. Federal Reserve Bank or correspondent bank for which the bank has not yet received credit is also part of vault cash. Let me skip back to maintaining reserves, A, B, and C. A, and this is, I guess, the 6th point under the form of the reserves. Under maintaining reserves, banks are required to maintain reserves in the form of vault cash and balances maintained in the Federal Reserve Bank or the pass-through correspondent. That we understand. B, banks that report reserves weekly are required to maintain reserves on average daily balances of deposits and euro currency liabilities during the maintenance period, which is a 14-day period beginning the 3rd Thursday following the end of the computation period. And C, banks that report reserves quarterly are required to maintain them on the basis of the bank's average daily deposit balance during each of the 7-day maintenance periods during the interval that begins on the 4th Thursday following the end of the institution's computation period and ends on 4th Wednesday after the close of the institution's next computation period. So I never had the privilege of doing this quarterly, so I'm just going to reread that. Banks that report reserves quarterly are required to maintain them on the basis of the bank's average daily deposit balance during each of the 7-day maintenance periods during the interval that begins on the 4th Thursday following the end of the institution's computation period and ends on the 4th Wednesday after the close of the institution's next computation period. Alright. Computation of reserves, Section C, under requirements. We've got 1 through 6 here. 1. Reserves are reported weekly or quarterly. 2. Banks that report reserves weekly are required to compute reserves on daily average balances of deposits and euro currency liabilities during the computation period, which is a 14-day period ending on the second Monday, every second Monday. 3rd, banks that report reserves quarterly are required to compute them on the basis of the bank's average daily deposit balance during a 7-day computation period that begins on the 3rd Tuesday of March, June, September, and December. March, June, September, and December. Okay. Reserves are computed by applying the appropriate reserve requirement ratio as determined by the Federal Reserve Board from time to time to net transaction accounts, non-personal time deposits, and euro currency liabilities of the institution during the computation time period. So you use the reserve requirement ratio multiplied by your different types of account balances. And fifth, cash items in process of collection and balances subject to immediate withdrawal due from other U.S. banks may be deducted from the gross amount of transaction accounts. That's items in process, in transit. Sixth, U.S. branches of foreign banks may not deduct balances due from another branch of the same bank, and Edge or Agreement Corps may not deduct balances due from a branch at the same Edge or Agreement Corp. Interest on reserves, subsection D under the requirements. This is the last subsection, second to last subsection. The last subsection is charges for deficiencies. And then the final closing section will be on penalties, supplemental reserves, and international banking facilities. So we'll learn something new today. Interest on reserves. 1 through 4. 1. The Federal Reserve banks will pay interest on required reserve balances and excess balances at rates that are determined by the Federal Reserve Board from time to time. Correspondent banks that are eligible institutions may pass through interest on reserve accounts to respondents. In cases where pass-through balances are held by ineligible institutions, the Federal Reserve Bank will pay interest only on required reserve accounts, and the correspondent must pass through the interest to the respondent. 4th, Federal Reserve banks may establish an excess balance account for eligible institutions, and such balances will be liabilities of the Federal Reserve Bank to participating eligible institutions. And A through G under this point about the excess balance account for eligible institutions is A. An excess balance is the average reserve balance over a reserve maintenance period held by or for an institution at a Federal Reserve Bank that exceeds the required reserve balance and any clearing balance for that institution. B. Eligible institutions must authorize another institution to act as agent for purposes of general account management. C. The agent may not commingle its own funds in the excess balance account. D. No required reserves may be maintained in the excess balance account. E. Funds in the excess balance account must be used exclusively for excess balances and may not be used to satisfy any reserve balance requirement or contractual clearing balance or for any general payments or other activities. F. Excess balance accounts must be used exclusively for the purpose of maintaining excess balances. And G. Federal Reserve banks may charge fees for services and impose conditions on excess balance accounts. Charges for deficiencies. Deficiencies in an institution's required reserve balance are subject to a charge equal to the primary credit rate in effect for borrowings from the Federal Reserve Bank plus 1%. Charges are assessed based on the daily average deficiency during each maintenance period. Federal Reserve banks may waive penalties except when the deficiency arises as a result of the institution's gross negligence. Penalties: $7,500 per day for violations, $37,500 per day if violations or unsafe or unsound practices are engaged in recklessly and constitute a pattern of misconduct, with losses and penalties up to $1.375 million per day against persons who knowingly and willingly commit violations and gain from it at the expense of the institution. Federal Reserves. The Federal Reserve Board may impose a supplemental reserve requirement equal to not more than 4% of total transaction accounts if 1 through 4. 1. The sole purpose is to increase reserves to a level essential for monetary policy purposes. 2. It is not for the purpose of reducing cost burdens resulting from the imposition of basic reserve requirements. 3. It is not for the purpose of increasing the amount of balances needed for clearing activities. And 4. On the day such supplemental reserves are required, the total amount of basic reserve requirements is not less than the ratios required by the Monetary Control Act. B. Under the supplemental reserve sections C and D, B is if supplemental reserve requirements are in effect for more than 1 year, the Federal Reserve Board must send a report to Congress stating the need for continuing the requirement. C. Supplemental reserves must terminate at the end of the first 90-day period after they are imposed, where the amount of basic reserves meets the ratio required by the Monetary Control Act. And D. Supplemental reserves must be held in an earnings participation account and earn interest at a rate not to exceed the rate earned on the Federal Reserve Board's securities portfolio during the previous calendar quarter. Last section, International Banking Facility. The definition is a set of asset and liability accounts segregated on the books of a bank, a U.S. branch of a foreign bank, or an edge or agreement court. IVF deposits may only be used to support IVF operations outside the United States and to make IVF loans only to finance corporations outside the United States. If IVFs must notify each of their customers of their restricted deposit taking and lending requirements. IVFs have special reserve requirements. Regular reserve requirements do not apply, and banks must notify the Federal Reserve before establishing an IVF.